Welcome to Dey Weekly, episode 9, week 9. Welcome. I'm your host, Tim Lyons from Running Through the Jungle. I'll provide a quick recap from week 9 versus the Las Vegas Raiders. And for all you fantasy football enthusiasts, I'll also cover the top 5 fantasy points scores from the week. I'll also include the perfect lineup and the I'm not so perfect lineup, and then drop in a little bit extra content as well. Now for week 9 versus the Raiders, the Cincinnati Bengals dominated the Las Vegas Raiders with a score of 41-24 on Sunday. Here are some key highlights from the game. Joe Burrow had an outstanding performance, throwing 5 touchdown passes to tie his career high. He finished the game with 27 completions on 39 attempts for 251 yards. Chase Brown stepped up in the absence of Zach Moss, rushing for a career-high 120 yards on 27 carries. I can't believe I'm saying that. Cincinnati Bengals ran the ball 27 freaking times. Now let's say run the damn ball a little bit more, huh? Now Trey Hendrickson had a standout game on defense, recording 4 sacks to bring his season total to 11 and leading the NFL in sacks. The Raiders struggled with quarterback Gardner Minshew being benched in the third quarter and replaced by Desmond Ridder, who also faced challenges. The Bengals offense was firing on all cylinders, while the Raiders defense couldn't contain Joe Burrow and the rest of the Bengals attack. It was a much-needed win for the Cincinnati Bengals to keep their season alive. Now, next up, Thursday Night Football on Amazon Prime versus the Baltimore Ravens. Now, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. If you want to hear our reactions to the game, check out Roaring Reactions on YouTube or listen on all your favorite podcast platforms weekly. Also, join us on Wednesdays for Running Through the Jungle predictions. And sometimes you might even catch Running Through the Jungle Strange Love crossover with our opponents from each week, if we can find an opponent that's willing to do that. Now, a quick commercial break, and I'll be right back with you. All right, I'm back. Now, to fantasy football, I'm going to start with the perfect lineup. If you had Jalen Hurts for Philadelphia, he had 29.9 points. Saquon Barkley had 32.9. A-Chain from the Miami Dolphins has 32.1 points. Smith Njigba, JSN for the Seattle Seahawks wide receiver, had 37 points. Garrett Wilson had 30 points. Our own Mike Gesicki from the Cincinnati Bengals had 27 points at tight end. And if you had a flex, maybe you ran Zay Flowers for 29.7 points. And Carlos Santos, the kicker from the Chicago Bears, had 13 points. And then for defense, the Los Angeles Rams had 20 points, scoring 251.6 points. Now to the I'm not so perfect lineup. If you had Kyler Murray in your lineup, he only had 4.76 points. Tank Bigsby for the Jacksonville Jaguars had 2.2 points. Devin Singletary only had 3.3 points. Xavier Worthy had a negative 1 point. Puka Nacua had 2.1 points. Cole Kmet had 0 points for the Chicago Bears. Michael Pittman Jr. had 2.4 points. Kicker Koo for the Atlanta Falcons had 3 points. And the Denver Broncos had negative 3 points with a total score of 13.76. So if you had that lineup this week, so sorry, you had an awful week. Now your top waiver wires for week 10, Tillman, he actually had a really good game last week. He was only rostered in 36.1% of leagues. Leggett, I know he had like 13 points last week. He's only rostered in 7.8% of leagues. Mike Gesicki, who was the number 1 tight end for the week, only rostered in 10.6% of leagues. So you might want to go and look up and pick up some of those waiver wires if they're available in your waiver wires. Now for week 9, starting with the quarterbacks. And I also wanted to say is The Cincinnati Bengals have 4 top 5 fantasy point getters for fantasy football this week. So anyways, at number 1, Jalen Hurts for Philadelphia versus Jacksonville at 230 yards, 2 touchdowns, 67 rushing yards, and 1 touchdown for 29.90 points. Sorry, I had to turn down my music. Joe Burrow at number 2 versus the Las Vegas Raiders had 251 passing yards, 5 touchdowns, 1 interception. He ran for 11 yards for 29.14 points. Patrick Mahomes versus Tampa Bay last night had 291 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 9 yards rushing for 24.54 points. At number 4, Daniel Jones had 174 yards passing, 2 touchdowns. He ran for 54 yards and 1 touchdown. He did lose a fumble, so he had 24.36 points. At number 5, Lamar Jackson versus Denver had 280 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. He only ran for 4 yards. That's unlike him. And had 23.60 points. Now to the bell cows and running the damn football, the running backs. At number 1, Saquon Barkley with his jukeness reverse hurdle, probably the best damn run I've ever seen in my life. He had 159 yards rushing, 1 touchdown. He had 3 receptions for 40 yards and 1 touchdown. He lost a fumble, but he still had 32.90 points. Devon Achane for Miami versus Buffalo had 63 rushing yards, 1 touchdown. He had 8 receptions for 58 yards and a touchdown. And he had 32.10 points. Alvin Kamara at number 3 versus Carolina had 155 yards, 6 receptions for 60 yards for 27.50 points, and they still lost to Carolina. Wow. Chase Brown, our own Cincinnati Bengal, versus the Las Vegas Raiders had 120 yards rushing. He had 5 receptions for 37 yards and 1 touchdown, 1 receiving touchdown for 26.70 points. And Derrick Henry, for the Baltimore Ravens versus Denver had 106 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 reception for 27 yards for 26.30 points. Now to the wide receivers. Jackson Smith Njigba, JSN, for Seattle had 7 receptions, 180 yards, and 2 touchdowns for 37 points versus the Los Angeles Rams. Garrett Wilson at number 2 versus Houston had 9 receptions for 90 yards and 2 touchdowns for 30 total fantasy points. Zay Flowers for Baltimore versus Denver had 5 receptions, 127 yards and 2 touchdowns for 29.70 points. D-Hop coming over to Kansas City, DeAndre Hopkins versus Tampa Bay had 8 receptions for 86 yards and 2 touchdowns for 28.60 points. Demarcus Robinson versus Seattle for the Los Angeles Rams, had 6 receptions for 94 yards and 2 touchdowns for 27.40 points. Now to the tight ends. Our own Mike Gesicki versus Las Vegas had 5 receptions, 100 yards, and 2 touchdowns for 27 fantasy points for number 1 at the tight end position. Travis Kelce versus Tampa Bay at number 2 had 14 receptions and 100 yards, and he lost a fumble, but he had 22 points. Cade Otton for Tampa Bay versus Kansas City had 8 receptions for 77 yards and 1 touchdown. He had 21.70 points. Josh Oliver for the Vikings versus Indianapolis had 5 receptions for 58 yards and 1 touchdown for 16.80 points. Taysom Hill for New Orleans versus Carolina had 19 rushing yards and 1 touchdown, 4 receptions for 41 yards for 16 points. Now to the kickers, to the football players that Brandon said they're not. So the non-football players, but the kickers. Santos for Chicago versus Arizona had 3 field goals. 2 of them were 50-plus yarders for 13 points. Tyler Bass for Buffalo versus Miami had 1 PAT and 3 field goals. 1 of them was for 50-plus yards for 12 points. Blake Group for New Orleans versus Carolina had 1 PAT and 3 field goals and 1 50-plus yarder for 12 points. Our own Evan McPherson versus Las Vegas had 5 PATs and 2 field goals for 11 points. And Chad Ryland for Arizona versus Chicago had 3 PATs and 2 field goals. One was 50-plus yards for 11 points. Now, to the defense, the Los Angeles Rams at number 1 versus Seattle had 7 sacks and 3 interceptions, scored a touchdown, allowed 20 points, and had 20 fantasy points. At number 2, the Los Angeles Chargers versus Cleveland, 6 sacks, 3 interceptions, and 10 points allowed, 16 fantasy total points. Indianapolis Colts versus Minnesota Vikings had 4 sacks, 2 INTs, 1 fumble recovery, scored a defensive touchdown, allowed 21 points for 16 total fantasy points. At number 4, the New York Jets, Jets, versus Houston, had 8 sacks, 1 fumble recovery, allowed 13 points, and had 14 fantasy points. At number 5, Arizona Cardinals versus Chicago had 6 sacks, 1 safety, allowed 9 points, and had 12 fantasy points. Now that is it for the Dey Weekly. Thank you so much for watching and listening. And please make sure that you like and subscribe and share with your friends. Go over to Running Through the Jungle on YouTube or on your podcast platforms. Like and subscribe and give us 5 stars on the podcast. Thank you so much again for watching. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week and take care. Dey.